From the treatment of migrants to freedom of expression to anti-terror laws, are standards of human rights across Europe slipping? This week on Conflict Zone, my guest in Vienna is Michel O'Flaherty, Director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Does he believe Europe is doing all it can to protect human rights? Michel O'Flaherty, welcome to Conflict Zone. In a recent report, the agency has said that civil society is under threat across the bloc. The report paints a paltry picture of the state of fundamental rights within the European Union.
It's a mixed picture. It's a picture of what's working and what's not working. We have to stay very vigilant in Europe, just like everywhere else in the world, to protect the incredible institutions we developed since the Second World War.
Not as everywhere in the world. Our foundation, the idea of the European Union, human rights, democracy, and it's not getting better.
It's changing. We have some improvements.
That's a very diplomatic word. Changing to the good or changing to the bad?
Changing to the good in some places, but right, I am very concerned about the situation of human rights in Europe today. We have a lot to do across so many issues, so many groups, migrants, older people, the disabled. There's a huge program of work to be done, but match the challenges with the achievements.
But you have said that, quote, 2017 was not a great year in terms of respect of protection and the promotion of human and fundamental rights. Not a great year? That's an understatement.
No, I agree. It was a very, very challenging time. It remains a challenging time. Take the migration crisis. It's still a crisis. We still haven't...
But it's not a crisis because of the migration. It is the crisis of democracy in the member states of Europe.
It's a crisis of migration policy. In other words, I largely agree with you. It's about a failure to show solidarity, to share the responsibility across member states. It's about failure to get the basics in place in so many places. We've been following the story very closely for the last 2 years. And yes, there have been some achievements, but in the bigger picture, we're not there yet. And in some ways, we're worse off. This fortress of Europe, it has less doors than it had previously, less access.
During the speech in Dublin at the Institute of International and European Affairs, you suggested that the European Human Rights Project is under threat. Frankly, you are accusing your own member states.
That's correct. I'm saying that we have a threat because of unacceptable levels of abuse and a resiling, a pulling away from the commitments in too many places, and on top of that, a lack of conviction in large parts of our citizens that human rights are important for them and not just for others. So it's a very big project of work, but I think we know where we need to go.
So let's look at the European political map. Some examples: Austria, Hungary, Poland, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, hate speech against minorities. They have become everyday practice in these countries.
I don't dispute with you that we have really serious and growing problems, and it's the job of my agency to get the data about those problems out there in the public domain. The actual experience of Muslims in Europe, the actual experience of Jews in Europe. Put that in front of the policymakers, the decision makers, and then challenge them to deliver on the human rights commitments.
They are the problem and not the solution in some countries.
It's not that simple. There's an enormous diversity of willingness to make for better societies. But it's not just the policymakers, the politicians who make our societies. It's also about civil society. It's also about the faith groups. It's the citizens themselves. And a large part of our work is to engage with them and to convince them that this is something worth fighting for.
Yeah, I will repeat my question. In some countries, are the governments the problem or the solution? Like Poland, for example?
I just wouldn't put it that simply. In some countries, we've got far more serious problems than others, but it ranges across all human rights.
But who is responsible for these problems? The governments, some even of the head of the governments, are a part of the movements, of the right radical movements. And this is something after World War II, which is coming back, and nobody would have believed that this could be and it is.
Yeah, but the great difference today is that we have strong international human rights standards by which we can and must hold these people to account. I'm worried that there's a lot of hate speech out there that goes unchallenged and unprosecuted. That's unacceptable. And so a large part of our work is demanding that the laws in place, which we did not have in place at the time of the Second World War, are complied with.
But we're getting more convenient with this. Since years, all these hate speeches are not anymore coming from the streets. These hate speeches are coming from presidents, from governments, from politicians. Look at the European Union. The European Union is also one of the reasons where we are listening to hate speeches, and this wouldn't be possible before. It is new.
Mm-hmm. Well,
it is legitimized.
Yeah. I also look at the European Union, which is doing a good job of taking hate speech offline, which is pushing back. And we've seen some improvements in this regard in the last few months. I'm not discouraged at all. I see a long way ahead. It's going to be a difficult pathway, but I think in the end we'll get there with the commitment of young people in our societies, the resilience of civil society, the increasing convergence of faith communities to do something meaningful to challenge these patterns.
It is understandable that you are optimistic. That's your job. But let's be realistic again. Let's have a look in Poland. Let's have a look in Hungary. Let's have a look in France. Let's have a look even in Germany. A very successful growth of parties who are anti-democratic. A part of their rhetoric is the headline, hate. Discrimination of minorities, sexual discrimination, racial discrimination, religious discrimination. These people partly are working with you. They are sitting in the European Parliament, but they are also sitting in all other institutions in Europe.
Well, our job is to uphold and demand respect for the system of human rights. We do that by putting evidence out there in the public domain, tackling the fake news, which in large part informs some of the phenomena you're describing, getting the data out there for the actual situation. No, Muslims don't bring sexual violence into Europe. We have our own problem. For example, no, the recent migration crisis did not bring anti-Semitism into Europe. That's long-standing. Constantly bringing the evidence
but the
and the
politicians
facts
in
before
Poland, the politicians
decision-makers.
in Hungary are saying that the Muslims are bringing the problems.
Well, to the extent that's being said, we're pushing back against that with the hard data.
But isn't it hypocrite that such an organization who is fighting against racism is being paid by countries like Poland and Hungary, where these governments are responsible that your work is increasing?
Okay, we're an agency of the European Union, which means we're somewhat separate from the decision-making institutions. We're also independent. I think we're very safely positioned to do our job with integrity, and it's a hell of a job to do, and it's badly needed right now, more than ever, indeed, to take your own words.
Which EU member state is respecting human rights the least these days?
I'm not going to answer that question because I don't think it's helpful. We're forever...
Why is such an information not helpful?
Because we're forever scanning the horizon of the 28
and my
member
question
states.
is, after all your research,
yes,
which EU member state is respecting human rights the least these days? You can also mention 2 or 3, but it is an information which is very important for us.
But the response I'd give to you is that it's neither helpful nor useful to name a particular country because there are problems everywhere. And human rights is not just about civil rights and political rights, it's also about social and economic rights. And when you see it broadly understood like that, the problems are everywhere. There's no worst, and by the way, there's no best either. There's serious efforts and struggles everywhere.
So let's talk about these countries where you have a lot of problems, where you feel that you are worried. Which are these countries?
Well, certainly, undoubtedly, we're concerned about the situation in Poland and in Hungary and a number of other states. I visit those countries whenever I have the opportunity. I meet with the government, I meet with civil society. I offer the tools and the experience of this agency to assist them in engaging their problems. And we see some small progress in this area. For example, I was in Hungary just a few weeks ago, and I was invited by the government to send a team to the so-called transit zones. These are the border points, the border crossing points, to see how a more human rights respectful system could be put in place. Those conversations are underway right now, but that's exactly the way our agency can make some small progress in contributing to the challenges in such places.
You mentioned counterterrorism and fundamental rights, and you mentioned a concern with legislation around security laws endangering human rights. You mentioned Spain, for instance.
Yes, well, certainly in terms of counterterrorism, we have an issue right now. We have a legitimate need for strong security, and we want to support that in a way that's respectful of human rights and doesn't compound the problems it's attempting to solve. This means we have some challenging conversations. We need states to slow down.
What is the challenge?
Slowing down, for instance, taking proper care, looking at the unintended consequences of actions, making sure that the limits on human rights, and there must be limits on human rights, that they truly are necessary for the purpose that's being sought to achieve. We're delivering research to assist this exercise.
But here again, you are talking with the governments, you are explaining to the governments, but the things are not going on as you want them to go. In Spain, the counterterrorism law was used, for example, to jail artists. One of the most famous cases was the arrest of two puppeteers who in a street performance used a pan in Basque that a judge ruled to be an excuse for terrorism. This seems like a clear violation of the right of free expression. Everything is argued with counterterrorism.
Sure. Well, to engage issues such as the one you described, which you find in a number of countries, we need the strong human rights legal analysis to challenge the practices of the state. It's not necessarily just the law, it's how the law is applied. Take profiling. We all recognize that you've got to make choices in policing of who to stop on a street. That's profiling. But profiling can be respectful of human rights, or it can be discriminatory and in violation of human rights. And it's one of the things our agency is doing is developing tools for intelligence and for police services so that they can avoid exactly the types of situation you gave in your example.
But nobody's really intervening. From the political level, nobody. The terror law was used in Spain. Let's have another example. By the High Court, now we are on the level of the High Court, sent 13 hip-hop artists to jail for years for what they called praise of terrorism in a song. I mean, what's going on in the European Union? In a country like Spain, people are in jail because they sang?
Well, look,
singing a song?
Yeah, the most important thing right now is to reignite passion about the Europe of values. We're not an economic Europe, we're one founded in human rights. And if we can better embed that culture, better engage it with the policymakers, then exactly the types of situation you're giving will be much rarer in the future.
We are talking about Poland. We are talking about Hungary. We are talking about Spain. We'll talk about other countries. And the research, your comments, your papers are also describing countries like Spain. Mm-hmm. So, where's the judgment? Why is the judgment, which is so important if a person like you is judging, why are you so shy?
Well, our function really is to gather the data so that the policymakers and the judges, courts and elsewhere, can take the necessary action. Get the data out there, do the analysis, make that available. It's a vital function because, as I said earlier, if we base our decision making on fake news, on false news, on myth, we're going to end up obviously with ridiculous outcomes.
But your information are not fake news.
No,
your
quite.
information are news.
So the question as to what are you doing with this stuff is better put to the decision makers,
who has
to the
to
judges.
do something with your information?
Ultimately, a human rights body like ours with only advisory functions is only as good as those who make the decisions.
But to whom are you giving the advice?
Governments of the EU member states, the EU institutions.
So, but you understand, you understand the paradox, you understand the problem? You are bringing in, information to countries which you are criticizing. And you demand that these countries will react. But they don't want to react. They are very happy as they are.
I'm not going to give Europe a clean bill of health. The problems are serious, the issues are grave, but I do see small chinks of light. I see small improvements. I gave an example of better oversight of intelligence services. Here we're having valuable conversations with governments about how to put in independent oversight. That's achievement. I've seen refugees, children, locked in cages when I first went to the hotspots in Greece a couple of years ago. They're not in cages anymore. That's an improvement. It's the 1,000 small steps that are making an important contribution to a better European future.
Jean-Claude Juncker said that what happened in Spain was an internal affair, also what you described. Violation of human rights in a member state can't be an internal affair, can it?
Well, human rights are not an internal affair. We're bound by a web of...
So Mr. Juncker is wrong.
No, I'm framing this in terms of human rights. And by that I mean that Spain and all the other EU member states are bound to human rights commitments which transcend the state. And it's very important that that the issues of human rights respect, promotion and violation...
human rights in a member state, is this an internal affair or not?
It depends on the context. For purposes of the EU and how it's structured, it may well be an accurate statement. But for purposes of human rights compliance, no, it raises issues under international human rights law.
So let's look at another important country, France. The French emergency law has been replaced with the anti-terror law. The new legislation, which went into effect last October, gives security forces the authority to shut places of worship without warrants. That means without actual proof. Religious freedom is one of the most important principles of modern humanist societies. How does this go hand in hand?
I think it's very important to speak with religious communities about that, because again, it's not necessarily the law that's the problem, it's the application of the law. And we need to speak to them and listen to the extent to which there are practices that they consider are violations of their rights, and in that way we form a consensus about the actual practice.
But this is a problem of the country, of the government, of the parliaments who are deciding these restrictions.
Yeah, but look, I once ran a human rights commission in an EU member state, and I was struck by the extent to which it's not the face of the law that's the problem, it's the way in which it's applied. And the manner in which it's applied can violate a right as easily as be respectful of the right. That's why it's important to generate the evidence, figure out what the principles that apply in that case look like in reality.
Evidence are the principle of the state of law.
We cannot make decisions without the hard data about what the situation is and how it impacts affected communities,
but you
typically minority groups.
You can arrest people today in France if they seems to be a terrorist, also without warrants. You can. Mm-hmm. The law is allowing this.
Okay, and then, but in terms of a question, what are you asking me to respond to?
What is your reaction on that?
Well, my reaction is, as I say, our job is to advise the EU so that the actions of the states, be they the laws or the application of the laws, is human rights compliant, but we're not some overall judge. We don't have that capacity, we're not set up in that manner.
Can somebody be neutral? Being an advocate for human rights?
No, we're certainly not neutral. Neutrality is typically taking the side of an oppressor in the context of human rights.
I want to quote again your report from January says about Hungary. In Hungary there were civil society reports that public officials continued to use libel and defamation laws to silence criticism from citizens and journalists. What are the consequences after this report? Something changed?
Well, we're making sure that the debates get triggered around Europe on the basis of that report. There was a discussion yesterday in the European Parliament in which the report was cited extensively. We're triggering conversations about the report in Budapest, in other capitals. By that means, we give civil society the tools for it to push back against unacceptable practices, and we're providing the basis, the knowledge base, as I mentioned earlier, for other states and for those with influence to engage the unacceptable behavior.
There are countries you don't have the freedom of speech as it has to be. Mm-hmm. And we are accusing, for example, countries like Turkey. Mm-hmm. What is the difference?
Well, we have to be just as hard on ourselves as we do with any other state outside the European Union. And again, as I say, that's the job for the entire of the European political community, not just for a single agency, which is providing the data and the evidence so that those hard words can be spoken. And I see those hard words spoken increasingly.
Again, is the situation getting better or not?
At the moment, we're in a bad situation, but I do see chinks of light towards the future.
Why?
Why? Because I see...
more and more governments in this European Union are all even on the top or on the junior parties which are openly discriminating, racists, nationalists, right-wing parties. From where is your optimism coming from?
It's coming from many places. For example, we're getting more serious about promoting economic equality and so-called socioeconomic rights, a dimension of human rights we haven't had a chance to speak much of in this conversation. I see it in young people. It could sound condescending, but genuinely, from traveling around Europe, meeting with youth groups and with children's groups, I see solutions being offered. I see a willingness to go over the divisions, to unite.
And I see more and more government power which are representing all these issues we are talking about.
Certainly there are populist tendencies out there against which we have to push very hard. But we can do that, as I said earlier, by shattering myth, by dispelling these crazy stories on the basis of which people are being rallied, by delivering for people better, tackling inequality, by showing that we can have fair societies based on human rights. And there are so many other dimensions. By the way, I also see, as I said, I think earlier, in faith communities, a greater desire to come together to resist these tendencies.
But Islamophobia is today in several countries a declaration of governments. It is an official declaration.
Certainly, hatred against Muslims and patterns of discrimination, as we see from our surveys, are very worrying. Something like 40%.
How can a country still be a member in the European Union if a country is not anymore respecting human and fundamental rights? How does this go on? What is the message that such a country is still representing the fundamental idea of human rights?
Okay, well, first, human rights is much broader than the framing of our discussion. It's also about putting food on the table, delivering healthcare. We have to make broad assessments about human rights compliance, taking all those dimensions into place. That said, I don't disagree with you. We do need stronger mechanisms and tools in Europe to hold states to account. We hold them to account before they enter, but once they're in the club, it doesn't work so well. And that's an area that is receiving attention right now in the context of strengthening the rule of law frameworks, something we're supporting.
You just mentioned that before. Let's look at the migration issue. In March 2016, the EU signed a deal with Turkey intended to keep back the refugee flow. Amnesty International says Turkey, quote, is not a safe place for refugees. Struggling to meet people's basic needs, the Turkish authorities are failing to ensure that refugees and asylum seekers are able to live in dignity. Human Rights Watch calls it a problematical deal. Has the EU abandoned its principles in order to keep away refugees?
We have a great deal to do. We have to be a more welcoming Europe, not for everybody, but for those who need international protection once they get here. And by the way, we aid people to get here in the Mediterranean by a dramatic level of sea rescues, which I think is under-acknowledged. But still, we have too many walls. Once they get here, they have to be treated with respect. We're still not there. We still don't have that respectful sharing of the responsibility. So this remains a very grave issue of human rights.
Sounds good. It's not the reality of the European Union today. Another country which is resolving the influx of refugees is Libya. Human Rights Watch says the EU has tried to prevent asylum seekers and irregular migrants coming by shifting responsibility for migration control onto countries outside the EU borders, notably Libya, in ways that expose people to human rights abuse. Do you accept this blame?
I accept that a much better job could be done of honouring the human rights of people trying to get into Europe. That does not mean letting every one of them in. It means letting in those in need of international protection.
We close the borders and we know consciously that these peoples are in Libya, in a failed state. We agree that these people are living in a failed state only with the argument we don't want to have them in Europe.
Our human rights guarantees extend to what we do outside Europe, and that has to be held in mind regardless of whether it's Turkey or Libya or any other country. It's the same degree of attention for the basic human rights and dignity of those people. But then, as I say, I really want to insist, once they get here, we have to do a better job of protecting their human rights. That is no less important.
Which countries are in your mind when you say something like that?
What I have in mind, actually, is the intolerable burden we've placed on Greece and Italy. We've left them to deal with this in a manner which is impossible. Where all of Europe was needed to resolve the problem, including towards respectfully receiving a fair number of people from Greece and Italy, which has still not taken place. And that worries me greatly.
Since this agency has come into existence, nothing has improved. On the contrary, human rights have deteriorated.
No, I wouldn't accept that at all. Since this agency has come into existence, we have adopted in Europe a Charter of Fundamental Rights which has hardwired protection of human rights into policy making. And I see that on a day-to-day basis, how the outcome is better because of the Charter. Since this agency came into existence, we have evidence on the situation in Europe of a quality that you'll find nowhere else in Europe. We know about the incidence of violence against women because of the surveys we've done, the incidence of anti-Semitism, the instances of Islamophobia, and, if I may finish, we have also seen how that data has fed into better policy making.
So I understand. We know more, but the situation didn't get better. Michael O'Flaherty, thank you for being on Conflict Zone. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.